So Jay, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Really, really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, so as I mentioned just before we start recording, I've been following your stuff for quite a while, and I really, really like the way that you think and the way that you explain science and critical thinking. And I think it's going to be a really, really interesting conversation for those who are interested in learning more, maybe not just about science, but just how to think. So would you like to give a quick introduction into who you are? That would be really helpful.
So, first, obviously, thank you for having me on again. My name is Jabien, also known as Science by Jay on Instagram. I typically cover nutritional science, but from the lens of sort of more of a public health, psychological and philosophical perspective, which is unique, I think, in the fitness space. So instead of talking about what are the right macro breakdown for certain people, or, what should a nutrient timing for athletes or something like that, I'm more so interested in the wider implications of nutrition and how that impacts health at a population level. And how do we think about nutrition in a critical sort of way? So those are my two main interests online, and that's what I hope to achieve as far as getting practitioners to think critically about these questions.
And how did you get into nutrition in the first place? Was that something that you studied at college? Was it a personal interest?
So when it comes to nutrition, believe it or not, I'm self-taught. So when I first got into college, or, they call it uni in other places, I studied psychology, and I was really interested in the connection between psychology and physical health, because I was reading some research about how physical activity was linked to decreased levels of depression and all sorts of stuff. So I was like, what else about lifestyle can impact, mental health? And another aspect of that was nutritional science. And so that's what got me into nutritional science in the first place. I bounced around a bit as far as believing, a lot of stuff that I don't believe now. Now, obviously trying to follow more evidence-based, science-based practitioners and seeing how they break down the literature, how they think about the literature, and how to think critically about nutrition itself. And understanding that even though nutrition is important, it's only a part of the puzzle. It's not the whole entire picture.
And yeah, that's really interesting. And I'm kind of surprised that you're able to teach yourself. I think a lot of people, probably the majority of people who are in, say this, what do you call them, educational creators or content creators for nutrition. A lot of them are self-educated, or a grand part of their knowledge is probably self-taught, or at least learned online, say through non-formal education. How did you kind of get so good at your ability to, I suppose, think critically and to be able to appraise certain types of research and be able to kind of look at it in that sense? Because that's a skill often that you would only get at a very minimum at a graduate level of study. It's in science.
So when it comes to, obviously science, I've always had an interest since I was a child. When I was younger, I wanted to be a paleontologist. I wanted to be a biologist. I wanted to be, anything and everything that had to do with a scientist. I just didn't know what to call it. I was always into science. So, when I got into university and I got some of the tools as far as learning how to read research itself, when it comes to research methodology, statistics, and the basics of both, I kind of took those and ran with it. When it comes to, I always say there's a difference between formal instruction and education. Education is taking what you know, but to the next level, and constantly refining, constantly teaching yourself, constantly looking at people who are smarter than you in the field and looking at what they're doing and how they're doing it. So that's pretty much how I approached nutritional science. At first, obviously I was following into a lot of the fads, as a lot of people do when they walk into this field. And then I started to realize, there's issues with these fads, and I started to question a lot. And so that eventually led me to follow people who had actual credentials in the area, PhDs, registered dietitians, those with MSs in nutrition. And I was just like, how are they thinking about the literature? How are they thinking about research? And I started taking some of their frameworks and applying it to the research that I was reading. and that ultimately gave me a better understanding of it. You know, I would never sit there and prop myself up as this all-knowing expert, but I'm definitely a lifelong learner when it comes to nutritional science, and also other fields as well, you know, psychology, philosophy, whatever. And I feel like these fields are all intertwined in some way, somehow. So that's how I try to bring my unique perspective into that.
Just on a side note of like philosophy, one thing that I do notice is that like I recently started using Twitter. I joined like many years ago, but recently started using it and following. I don't know if it's. I think it's just suggestive posts or through the algorithm. But like a lot of the people who are in the carnivore camp, their pictures on their profiles are like, you know, Seneca or Marcus Aurelius, and I don't know whether it's like, you know, what the link between stoicism and eating carnivore diet is, but there seems to be some sort of link there, as if that's maybe like a masculine or a virtuous trait to be. I don't really know, but it's pretty funny, just something that I noted.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, the misappropriation of Stoicism, because at one point I was really into Stoicism. I formally studied Stoicism with an actual philosopher. So, you know, we looked at the primary literature, we looked at sort of what the actual text we're trying to get at. And what people who don't understand is when they talk about these quotes of Stoicism, they're talking about the ethics, so how we ought to live. But there's a whole rich history with metaphysics, with logic-based systems in Stoicism. Like there's so many working parts in the Stoic philosophy that we probably wouldn't even think about. And I don't want to make this all about Stoicism, obviously, because it's more about nutrition. But I think the misappropriation happens when you read a couple quotes from, you know, people that you generally agree with, and you start running with those, but you don't look at their broader work. You know, for instance, I see a lot of people quote Marcus Aurelius, but if you actually read Meditations, Marcus Aurelius talks about caring about one's community, being of service, you know, understanding that people are not perfect, but you still have to help them in whichever way possible. And that's something that's often missing from the conversation. People would like to talk about, you know, well, self-reliance and only worrying about what's in your control. But no one wants to talk about, you know, the grand community that is humanity and how do we help our fellow man out, which is also part of Stoicism.
Yeah, probably most of them haven't read any of it, or couldn't understand any of the copies of any of the translated copies of Meditations. One final note on, like, I suppose modern day philosophers is that I noticed that, like, a lot of the, say, rich or successful people, that especially those who put out like YouTube content, which one came first, being, you know, rich and famous or putting out YouTube content, they're almost seen as like the modern day philosophers, where they'll be like very successful in one area, let's say business, and then all of a sudden they're giving this like life advice, as say the Stoics would be back in, you know, 2000 years ago, which is just another pretty interesting thing. And that's a lot of like young guys will look up to, which is just something that I noted. But I digress.
Right.
Because I know we're just going to end up talking about philosophy for about an hour.
Which I'm totally down for. I totally love philosophy. I love talking about it. And now I'm studying it on the graduate level. So I'm trying to currently get my master's in philosophy. So when we talk about like these type of topics, like there's just so much history. There's so much richness to each philosophical school of thought. It's not just, you know, you read one passage or one quote or one book and you automatically understand it. There's just so much going on.
Yeah, I get you. But let's maybe we'll save that for another conversation another day.
Yeah, you definitely should.
So yeah, I guess you mentioned a little bit about the kind of the camps of like some of the fallacies that you'd fallen for before, and I think we all did. I do recall the first time that I ever read the bodybuilding.com forums, and there was a guy who was going to eat a little bit of junk food and do some extra cardio on the treadmill to kind of burn that off and see how that would body react. And I remember I ate a packet of crisps, as we call them, you know, potato chips, and I was like kind of shocked that like I was eating these, because I hadn't eaten them, at least not in a binge, in a long time. Obviously that was, you know, when I was like 17, which was a long time ago. But I also, and I think it's almost like a rite of passage where you fall for these fallacies or camps. Why do you think that these nutrition extremes exist? Like they can't exist at the same time. You can't have someone. It can't be both true that, veganism is absolutely terrible because of plants are, they're toxic and they have anti-nutrients and they're terrible for you, at the same time as others are saying, meat is extremely terrible for your health and you should be following a completely vegan diet. They can't be, coexist at the same time, at least both camps. Right. So why do people fall for these extremes? And when I was thinking about this podcast, or some questions, I was thinking it doesn't really exist so much in, say, the exercise space, a little bit, but it almost seems that when new information comes out, it's kind of broadly gets adopted over time, and you don't have extreme people saying like, oh no, weightlifting is terrible for building muscle. Most people kind of accept like new information, and there's a little bit of nuance within that, but within nutrition, it's like it's a mess to say the least.
Right. I think part of the issue with nutritional science is that, unlike, my personal opinion, like exercise science, not everyone lifts weight, but everyone eats. So everyone has an opinion about what's the best way to eat. So obviously, when it comes to tribalism and nutrition, we have to understand fundamental human psychology. I think that's something that's missing from the conversation. There's this good book that recently came out called The Power of Us, and it's pretty much describing, like social psychologists describing how who we identify with, our social identity, impacts our thoughts, beliefs, and behaviors. And obviously, this is what's happening. People are identifying based on what they eat. And that's a lot easier than identifying, I guess, by how much, like what lifts you like to lift by. I think like majority of the time, compound lifts are uncontroversial for most people. But, when we're talking about the nuances within nutrition, there's still some things that we don't yet know. Like we don't fully understand, GI issues. We don't fully understand the microbiome. We don't fully we have some questions that we still need to answer within the field itself. And these gaps of knowledge are leading people to seep in with their own BS and their own ideologies and their own explanation for what's going on. And it's really easy from that point to form a social identity around a particular diet or a particular way of eating or a particular perspective within nutrition. So it really is about fundamental human psychology. It's about groupthink. It's about group dynamics. And it's about a person's self-identity as a carnivore dieter, as a vegan dieter, or whatever other dieter you want to put out there. It's deeper than just diet, obviously, but that's the starting point.
And do you think it is because that person might have had good success, whatever success means, like if they had an issue or they were trying to reach a specific goal, that they've had success with that, then that means they identify as that being the way that will help everybody?
Yeah, so a lot of times if you get into discussions online with people who are very fanatic, really adamant about their certain dietary approaches, it's usually from a very personal place. So we often prop up our personal stories above all else. Because I don't want to make generalizations about humanity, but we're often very egotistical. So we often see things through the frame of our own experiences, and our own experiences often supersedes what other people have to say about it. So, if I sit there and bring up data showing that, vegetables aren't detrimental to your health, but you're like, I lost how much weight on a carnivore diet. How can you tell me that this approach is not working? It worked for me. So we often fall into this trap of thinking that just because something worked for us, that it has to work for most people or other people. Another issue is, we confuse short-term gains with long-term viability. So I talked recently about there was this rice diet back in the 1960s that tried to combat hypertension. And individuals lost weight eating majority carbohydrates, majority rice and fruit juice. And some of them felt amazing. Some of their biomarkers actually improved. Their hypertension went down. their cholesterol levels improved, but those are the short-term gains, long-term viability. You could feel great just by losing weight or have your biomarkers look good from losing weight in the short term, but is it a long-term viable strategy? And that's something that I think most people don't want to talk about when it comes to their personal experience with nutrition.
I actually, on that topic, I interviewed, it was many years ago, before I actually started the podcast, and just did some YouTube videos. I can't remember his second name, but his name was Anthony, and he was actually featured in Alan Aragon's research review, and for 100 days, he just ate ice cream, whey protein, and beer, and he lost 30 pounds. And he in the short term he felt better, but then he was saying towards the end he started to feel terrible because he's got no fiber, it's like probably deficient in various micronutrients, and just is just basically living off sugar and not very not very voluminous food. So yeah, that does make a lot of sense. And I think that's what one thing that comes to mind is the carnivore diet, where people often see that as a fix for gut health or for gut problems, because it's essentially elimination. But over 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, how would the gut actually respond to that, or what are the instances of GI problems or cancer associated with the GI tract? Who knows? And I think I think that also leads to another problem, whereas, like you said, there's people filling in these gaps. Especially I see a lot around the microbiome, and clients that I would work with have gone to like a gut specialist, not a gastroenterologist or something, but a Facebook or Instagram gut specialist, and they've got all these tests. And I'm kind of saying, well, there's not that much information around the gut, and I'm not an expert in it, and I'm saying, well, we don't know, but yet there's someone over here saying like, oh, I know exactly what you should do, and here's what you should do, and here's what this means, and here's what you should take. It's hard for them, even if they're an intelligent person, to kind of say, well, I'm just going to go with the guy who says he doesn't know,
Right. Because confidence, confidence is persuasive. If you're going through a particular issue, let's say GI problems, immunological dysfunction. I'm trying to think what's the term for it. It's when it's something that we don't like. The immune system. We don't know a lot about entirely the immune system. Why the immune system starts attacking the body. Autoimmune disease. That's what it is. Autoimmune disease. We don't know a lot about GI issues. We don't know a lot about, especially when it comes to the microbiome. But I'm sorry about that. But obviously people would try to be confident and try to put their own spin on things and give people answers to their desperate questions and their desperate problems that they're dealing with. So they're obviously going to fall into whatever those answers are, whether those answers are evidence-based or not. They're in a desperate situation. They want relief. They want someone to listen and pay attention to them. They want answers. So, I mean, that's why a lot of people often fall into those traps.
And is that why you think the same thing happens in, say, like alternative medicine, where like traditional medicine or what they might call Western medicine may not be working, and like people start to try all these various things to try and cure themselves of their diseases?
Yeah, so when it comes to alternative medicine, the main issue I see is modern medicine is very efficient, but it's often not very, there's not enough time. There's not enough time for patients to really talk to their doctors, really get to know their doctors. And a lot of times, especially when we talk about issues that we don't fully have answers for, I'm not saying that it's often brushed to the side, but, people are not given what they want as far as a certain answer. So if you have someone that listens to you, that does an hour-long session with you, takes into consideration everything that you're saying, and gives you some type of answer for your problem, that's going to be very seductive. That's going to be very, that's going to pull you in a lot. So, obviously we have to take those things into consideration as far as, what are some of the pitfalls of modern day medicine, and what does alternative medicine promise in place of that? Whether those promises are true or not is irrelevant to how it makes people feel, because ultimately when it comes to health, people are very emotional. People want to feel relief. They don't want to be in their situation.
Yeah, I get you. And it is very difficult for people to know what is true and what is not true, because even myself, yesterday I was reading some stuff. Like I just finished a couple of months ago a master's in sports nutrition, performance nutrition. So it's not even like I did it, but previously I was studying a master's in nutrition, but I swapped. But even within that, there's so much stuff that's not covered. And I was reading yesterday something about monosodium glutamate, and just seeing what was the current data on it, because I saw some videos saying that it's like, you know, terrible for your health, but without any evidence. So I looked into it, and there's research papers saying there is, like, it's very detrimental, and then there's a lot of information essentially, and I spent a lot of time reading that, and there's so many papers that I didn't even go through them all. But then if you think about someone who has never even studied science or doesn't even know what PubMed is, but yet they're very intelligent, how are they supposed to know what information is good information and what information is bad information, even considering you have people who are, say, MDs and sometimes even PhDs that will spout this, rubbish online about whatever, like, you should eat more saturated fat, or sugar
Right.
is going to increase your risk of cancer and things like that.
So, I mean, obviously when we get into issues like that, we have to think about, there's this concept that I learned from David McRaney, who is in charge of the podcast You're Not So Smart. It's a really good podcast. I really encourage a lot of people to listen to it. But he talked about information silos. So, during a natural disaster, often your normal modes of communication and information gathering are shut down. They're not the same as they were before the disaster hit. So how do you gauge what to trust as far as information? You use trust-based cues. So I look at it this way. If a person doesn't have the background in science, or, to look through the literature or whatever, they're in an information silo. Regardless if they have Google at their fingertips or not, they're not equipped to answer the questions. They're not equipped to look into the topic at hand. So they have to rely on trust cues and trust signals. So whoever conveys that, whether it be an MD or PhD or whatever, that's full of, excuse my French, but bullshit, they're going to fall into that because they ultimately try to trust that individual. So that's something that we have to consider. Like, trust is a big part of believing and not believing in bullshit.
Yeah, and I guess it is challenging, because one thing I've kind of thought about myself is that people who have, say, studied, and I'm kind of have an echo chamber of, say, nutritionists and things like that, or dietitians, and not so much medical field, but people within that field that I would like follow and consume content from, and exercise science, is that when various conspiracy theories have arose over the last few years for various different reasons and events that have come up, they're less likely to engage in those things. And obviously it's not because they know about the medicine. Like, I know absolutely nothing about medicine, but yet my ability to be able to gauge, what something is maybe conspiratorial or not is better, so to speak. And that's something that I'm just curious about, and how others can perhaps think about that, not just in nutrition, but when other things come up, like a future pandemic or other conspiracies.
So, I mean, like, when it comes to thinking critically about health, I mean, like, the problem is that, we often, a lot of people are very distrustful of, governmental sources, authoritarian sources that we like to see expertise. So I think we need to get rid of this idea that, to distrust the experts. They're experts for a reason, right? An individual is an expert in virology for a reason. They're expert in immunology for a reason. They're expert in nutrition for a reason. So I think first we need to respect expertise when it comes to health, and realize that expertise is not always translatable. So just because someone's a cardiologist doesn't mean that they're going to understand the gut microbiome. Someone who, obviously has a PhD in one area is not going to be so smart when it comes to another area. They're a very specialized expert. And this is not to say that people can't know certain things across disciplines, because obviously we're talking about nutrition right now, but I don't have a clear background in nutrition, if we're really being honest. But the difference between, I guess, myself and people out there who spew bullshit online is that I trust the experts. I look at what they say and I try to learn from them. So I'm not trying to downplay the establishment. I'm not trying to be a contrarian. I'm trying to understand why the knowledge base is the way it is. And that is a different approach than saying, oh, all those doctors or all those scientists or all those whatever officials are lying to me because of X, Y, and Z. Sort of like the conspiratorial thinking. I think when it comes to critical thinking, one of the hallmarks is curiosity. When you're a scientist, you're often trained to be curious. You're trained to test your hypothesis. You're trained to test your assumptions. And, that's something that I constantly try to strive for.
Yeah. I think for me, one of the biggest, I suppose, trust builders, because there's areas like that I have not really much clue about, even within nutrition, say specific mechanistic pathways, etc., that I'm interested in, is that if they're willing to be questioned and open to debate, but not just debate for the sake of debate. I recently read the book by David Robert Grimes. They call it in Europe the irrational ape. In America, they call it good thinking. And he mentioned that people wanted to debate him on TV about HPV vaccine or something like that, and he was saying, well, he was rejecting it not because he didn't want to debate it, but it wasn't something up to be. It wasn't debatable. It was like, no, it's a fact. And actually, right, debating that would be giving the opposite side of something that's been proven to be true, and the opposite of that, it would be giving it, I suppose, a foundation to be built off. So it's not like somebody like, let's say, David Sinclair saying that whatever pathway, MNO or whatever the gene is, whatever the gene is called, that it increases longevity. Like, he will not debate that with people. Or resveratrol, he will not debate anybody, even colleagues that he has worked with previously in the lab. He won't debate them on their findings because, maybe because he knows that it's not true, but that does the opposite, and I have zero trust then in things that he says, because he's just not willing to debate something that even other experts are saying are perhaps up for debate or are not necessarily 100% true. So that's right. That's kind of one heuristic that I have myself. Moving kind of on then a little bit into another side of nutrition, which you said we talk about as well, is more on the public health. There's something that you said you're interested in, and this is so obesity. So I know it's kind of a bit of a turn, but also it's something that it affects a lot of people, not just personally, but from a society perspective, and it's something that's ever increasing. What do you think are, say, the primary causes of obesity at the moment, or what does the evidence show? And I know, of course, it's an excess of calories when we boil it down, but what is causing that?
So when we talk about obesity, we need to reframe it from just talking about excess caloric intake. Obviously, we know that that's the case. That's the mechanism by which people become obese. You cannot become obese merely because, your metabolism is broken. No, you had to overconsume calories over a certain amount of time, whether that's a long time, short amount of time, whatever, and that led to weight gain. However, where we get there is complicated. So it depends on societal factors, psychological factors, biological factors, and a whole bunch of factors in between. It's not simple. For instance, I just released pretty much a newsletter article showcasing that if we do public health interventions as far as, cutting down on advertising high salt, high sugary foods, and high fatty foods, people's caloric intake decreases. That's by cutting down on advertisement. So that's a societal, social, psychological factor that, if we address, can lead to decreased caloric intake. Another instance is food reformulation. There's products that can be reformulated to be lower calorie. And when you do that, people's caloric intake decreases. So it's not just a matter of individual willpower, individual choice, but it's also a matter of what are the psychological, sociological factors that are impeding biology in a way that are getting people to overconsume in the first place. You get what I'm saying? And then not only that, we also have to look at the genetic component. And we also have to look at, I guess, people's medical history. You know, there's people that, for whatever reason, they have issues with their thyroid. It leads to decreased thermogenesis, and that can impact caloric balance, energy balance, and that could lead to weight gain. You know, so, I mean, there's definitely a lot of different factors. On a population level, it's more of a biopsychosocial phenomenon than anything. I wouldn't say it's purely a matter of biology. I wouldn't say it's purely a matter of psychology or society, but it's all of these things put together.
There does seem to be a disproportionate amount of obesity at a population level in those areas that are more economically deprived. And I think there's various reasons why that might be the case. I think in the UK, there's like, I don't know if it's a linear correlation, but certainly some sort of casual relationship between the number of McDonald's and other fast food chains and the average income or the social deprivation in that area. And what would your thoughts then be on from your psychology background? Like, I remember it was a while ago, I try not to like get too involved in public health because it's not my domain area, but somebody replied to something when I mentioned it's more than just calories. It would be, they may not have access to these foods, but you can eat a healthy diet if you go to, say, the equivalent of a Kmart or something like that, Costco, and get rice and beans, and you can get like a can of beans for 20 cents, and you can get a kilogram or whatever it is, 2 pounds of rice for $1, and you can feed yourself for 3 days. Like, technically that's true. And what would your thoughts be from that perspective? Then we say, well, it's just individual responsibility. If they wanted to lose weight, they could just eat rice and beans and some salt or whatever.
I mean, first of all, I love rice and beans as a Hispanic man. That's part of my culture. But to say you could sustain yourself off of rice and beans shows a complete lack of understanding of nutritional quality. There's, obviously going to be some vitamins and minerals and macronutrients devoid from that sort of diet. And also, to put it plainly on the shoulders of the individual, you're assuming that person has time to cook. You're assuming that person has equipment to cook. You're assuming that person has access to a market. You're making so many different assumptions about that particular person, let alone the whole entire population. If it was so easy to have a nutritious diet, why are so many people in the United States, for instance, so food insecure? Why are they relying so much on food pantries? Why are they relying so much on social services? So it's not a matter of, well, this person is just being lazy and could go to the supermarket and just buy cheap foods. No, you're making so many different assumptions about that person. You're assuming they have time. You're assuming they have energy. You're assuming they have equipment. You're assuming that they have the funds. You're assuming so many different things. And if you're in an area deprived of, nutritious food options, you're going to turn to the alternative, which is fast food chains. It's not so simple. It's not so like the one person could sit there and just make a difference in their whole entire life. It's the systems in place, which, like I said before, can impede upon and influence actions that people take.
And do you think, because I know it's a public health problem across the whole population, but do you think at an individual level that most people would want to say that most people that are obese, that even in those areas where it's very difficult for them not to be because they're in an obesogenic environment, do you think that they would not want to be obese, and that the effort barriers to get there are just so high? Or would it be that a lot of people actually, they don't care so much, not in the sense that they don't care about their health, but it's not just a huge problem to them other than what may come down the road?
Right. I mean, Obviously, like I talked about those interventions, public health interventions before in the past, where if you cut down on advertisement, you do food reformulation, and you work on the food systems in place, people often consume less calories from, high salt, high fat, high sugary foods, and they're consuming more nutritious foods. So, obviously, those public health interventions showcase the fact that it's not just individual choice. There's other factors going on that are influencing people's actions to seek out certain foods in the first place or have access to certain foods in the first place. And, another thing that I want people to consider, especially in this public health sort of realm, is that, obviously there are greater societal factors which lead a person down a particular path. When it comes to, let's say, obesity, I don't remember the name of the study from right when I'm thinking about it, but there was a study done in the UK with the UK Biobank data looking at socioeconomic status and lifestyle. Those who had, let's say, the worst lifestyle factors, but the highest socioeconomic status, didn't suffer as much from poor health outcomes compared to those who had the best lifestyle and low socioeconomic status. So obviously we need to think about greater societal factors which impede upon people's health. Do people even have access to healthcare? Like if they get sick, or it's just a lot more complicated. I wouldn't say that people are willingly choosing to be obese. I think it's a function of their environment, which is like if you're in an environment that puts pressure on you to make certain choices, you're going to make those choices. And if there's no impact on that environment, then, obviously, what choices do you really have? And another thing, too, that I really want people to understand is that private industry is the driving force of public health. Not government, not, other people, individuals, but corporations, food corporations. They're the ones advertising. They're the ones formulating these foods. They're the ones building these restaurants. They're the driving force of public health in many instances.
So not to kind of sound like Sam Harris, but do we have any freedom of choice? Is free will a thing? Because you will say, well, no, we shouldn't have sugar tax because I should be allowed to decide what I want to eat.
I'll give you an analogy. Let's say I would say the illusion of choice. Let's say you have 10 different options, but let's say you had 100 different options, hypothetical options, but you can only afford to choose 3 of those options. Do you really have the wide range of choice? Do you really have options? Sure, you have those 3 options, but you're constrained. You can only make 3 different options out of 100 because of your situation. So you're not allowed to fulfill your full potential of choice because of your constraints. Giving people the opportunity to make choices as far as health means that we have to offer the wide range of choices and make those choices available to them. If not, we can't be surprised when they make certain choices.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I guess it's probably a huge question to ask, and if you knew the answer, you'd be making a lot of money. But what is the potential solution? Is it policy change? And what are those policy changes? Is it that the fast food industry gets taxed to the gills, or is there more restrictions around that, or is it more incentives from governments to poor families with universal basic income or something like that?
I mean, obviously, I don't have all the answers for that. I have some ideas.
Let me write them down.
I have some ideas, but we do know that regulating advertisement for foods that I mentioned before that are high salt, high fat, high sugary foods, regulating those advertisements can help decrease caloric intake. Obviously, for the United States, for instance, increasing the quality and access of foods available in food banks and food pantries is important. People often rely on food pantries and food banks, but they're not allowed to have these nutritious foods because they don't have the equipment to hold them. They don't have storage. They don't have whatever. So, I mean, that's another option. And another option would be, you know, sort of like a tax, whatever you want to put on particular food items, or bans on particular food items. And another solution could be reformulation, forcing manufacturers to make, I guess, more helpful options when they're making their products. So, I mean, those are potential policy solutions that we can enact, and we do have evidence that they could work. But, you know, obviously there's going to be a lot of conflict of interest. There's going to be a lot of money involved. There's going to be a lot of different factors involved. And, you know, for some place like the United States, unfortunately, the dollar rules.
Yeah.
So I'll just leave it off at that.
Yeah, I mean, like, it's really hard to see how they would make decisions that's going to financially hurt them. You can even see that with, like, the U.S. president meeting the Prince of Saudi in France recently, and the president of France rolling out the red carpet for them, given, like, they know exactly what the history is that they've been doing. It's just because the oil or whatever, and because of all of the blocks from Russia and things like that. So it's hard to see how that would play out. So you're saying it's not seed oils that we need to cut out of the diet, and that's why everyone's obese now?
No, I think it's these greater societal factors. If you want to read more about this, there's a great paper out there called The Nutritional Transition, which focuses on the research and development of a more obesogenic environment in developing countries, because of the same issues that we're dealing with here, with these really grand, big food corporations influencing policy and influencing what's available, choice, like we said before. I obviously encourage everyone to read into something like that, the Nutritional Transition. Just look that up on Google, see whatever you can find, read up on it. It's really impactful and powerful stuff. You know, we try to put this simplistic narrative that one thing is causing X outcome, when it's a bunch of different factors that we're putting into play. A diet is the sum of its parts. It's not its parts. So when we're talking about dietary patterns, we need to think about it as a pattern. You know, obviously we have clear and powerful evidence that seed oils are not inflammatory. They're not harmful. If anything, they're beneficial. The problem is that, you know, Americans, they're consuming more than 10% of their diet in saturated fat. They're consuming really high amounts of sodium. They're consuming a lot of added sugars. They're consuming a lot of refined grains. And, you know, they're not following any USA dietary guidelines at all. So we can't blame that. So we had to look at these bigger factors and the bigger pieces to the puzzle.
It is pretty funny when people say, like, the public health guidelines for nutrition are making people fat. It's like, well, nobody actually follows them. But it'd be interesting to see, like, just given that, like, some countries in Asia and Africa are, like, really poor, and people are not overweight because they literally have trouble finding food, full stop. It's like, over the next few decades or century, as these countries get, you know, they get richer, or the GDP increases, but they still remain relatively poor compared to developed countries, will the obesity in these countries absolutely skyrocket because they will still be poor? There'll be still challenges with access to kitchens and fridge freezers and things like that. And it's something that I just kind of thought about, that, like, those countries may explode because they'll still be relatively poor, but they'll have enough money to perhaps buy fast food, and you know, they'll be at a level comparative to poorer areas of developed countries. Just kind of thought.
I mean, we're seeing it right now, overnutrition in these countries. You know, look at China, for instance. Ever since its modernization and development, obesity rates have increased. While it's not the same level as the United States, it's still an increase. It's a notable increase. So, you know, these are things that we have to consider when we modernize and urbanize. There are certain factors in place that are going to happen, and we're seeing it across different populations. Those in developing countries and who are impoverished are more likely to become obese when we start modernizing those countries. So, I mean, I don't think it's a coincidence. It can't be.
And when we break it down into, say, demographics, are we seeing the increase in obesity rise or stagnate at a different rate compared in the upper class, whatever the upper class is, or say the top 25 percent quartile versus the bottom quartile in terms of the increases in obesity in, say, like US or the UK?
So, I mean, obviously the bottom quartile are the ones that are more at risk for increasing rates of obesity. Those of higher socioeconomic status often can't afford to follow health, dietary lifestyle patterns that a lot of us can't. And they're more likely to have access to healthcare. They're more likely to have access to quality healthcare. They're more likely to have leisure time to care about, these different facets of their life. So, of course, we wouldn't see as much rise in obesity in those levels. But, obviously, like I said before, in my previous example for the UK, even if they were obese, they still would be better off than those who were obese and impoverished. They just would be. And it's because of these greater factors that, we're talking about. Access to healthcare, access to nutritious foods. They can afford a chef. They can afford a coach. They can afford certain things that probably other people can't. They can afford to go to the gym. That's another barrier that a lot of people don't have time. They don't have money, So, I mean, when it comes to thinking holistically about nutrition, we need to include not only the biochemistry and metabolism, we have to include public health factors.
Yeah. And this is the final question, but you kind of answered it broadly throughout this conversation, but can personalized nutrition be extrapolated to the public or to the public health guidelines?
I would say no. I would say that we have certain dietary patterns. We say patterns for a reason. Not everyone has the means or the motivation or the ethical considerations or whatever to follow the same dietary pattern as someone else. And individual differences are important. Like there's certain people that have celiac disease. They can't eat gluten, so obviously we can't just apply that to everyone because not everyone has celiac disease. Or you're talking to someone who has diabetes. Their blood sugar levels are more of a concern or consideration than a regular person who doesn't have diabetes. So personalized nutrition is really important for the individual. On a population level, we usually try to follow patterns. We try to follow general guides for what we should be doing. But obviously there's going to be nuance in that because not everyone has the same situation. Not everyone has the same health history. Not everyone has the same medication history. Not everyone has the same factors going on for them. So I think when we're talking about this broad public health approach, we need to think in terms of patterns of diet. When we're thinking in terms of individual, we need to think in terms of individual needs. What do they need? What is optimal for them? What do they even want? Because that's also an important consideration too.
Yeah. So I do get frustrated sometimes when I read online. That the probably common denominator here is I stopped reading stuff online, but is when I see like nutritionists, which obviously is a catch-all term, saying that people can just use MyFitnessPal or create a deficit and lose fat as if because it's worked for their client who lives in Rhode Island and pays them $200 a week to train them. That can be extrapolated to someone in, say, a poorer state or a poorer part of a poorer state. It does get frustrating because I guess it's just a lack of knowledge from their point, and some people not really, and even this would have been me a couple of years ago, not realizing that some people they simply don't have a fridge or a microwave.
Yeah,
it's crazy to think that's quite a large percent of the population, or much larger than you thought. But right. It's been great to talk to you, Jabien. So thanks so much for coming on. What's new at you? What keeps you up at night, and what's next?
So what's new with me is I moved to a new city. So obviously, as you can see in my background, this is not my room. I moved to Philadelphia.
Nice. Up the Sixers.
So, the big city. I mean, I'm here trying to go to my new university, which I'm studying philosophy. What was the next question? It was, what's new with you?
What keeps you up at night?
What keeps me up at night? I think what keeps me up at night is
other than the roommates.
As you saw, right, is the existential dread that pretty much humanity has so much knowledge at their fingertips, but they just don't know what to do with it. I think that's what keeps me up at night. You know, how could people who are seemingly smart think so uncritically? That's what really bothers me. And what's next is obviously like finishing this master's, trying to do a PhD, probably in psychology, and help people think critically on an individual and societal level about many of these factors related to lifestyle. I think lifestyle and mental health are very interconnected. I think we overemphasize one and not the other. And I think that we don't look at these grander factors that impede upon one and the other. So I think that's going to be the focus of what I really want to get at.
Awesome. And where can people find more about what you and your work?
So I'm on Instagram at Science by Jay. So it's at Science by J, Jae. I'm also on Twitter, same handle. Also on TikTok, same handle. I'm also on Substack, same handle, but at Substack.com. I usually do my newsletter and stuff like that. So I mean, if you really want to look at my work, my Substack is the best place to look at that.
Awesome. I'll put all the links in the show notes. Once again, thanks so much for coming on, man.
Thank you for having me.
All right.